What's up everybody? Mods here. Today we're diving into an important topic for modding with Arc Devkit inside Unreal Engine 5. We'll be talking about CCAs, or more commonly known as Singletons. These are the brains of a lot of the major mods out there. You can use them for pretty much whatever you want. They keep track of a lot of information and you can store it across server saves and loads. So server restarts essentially. So for UIs and scoreboards and just advanced systems, so say you have like waves of dinos fighting and you want to keep track of those waves. You want to have one actor that does that. You don't really want to have 10 actors that are just trying to sync up, because things happen. So you just want to have one brain that controls all the little things. And CCAs or Singletons are the brain that you're looking for. And I've used them in pretty much every mod I've ever made. They can be super complex, they can be super simple, and they're super light. So there's not really a reason to not use them. I'll be going over how to use script commands. I'll be going over a very small tutorial on how to do a score counter for deaths specifically, and I'll be touching some multi-use. I'll be going over how to bind to the shooter game mode, how to bind to the shooter game state, as well as places for really good information and how to access that information across the game. I'll be going over a little bit of INI. I didn't actually base this on INI all that much, but there is a little bit. There's some ways on how to post to the shooter game log, as well as how to use script commands to find a player by their EOS, and how to apply commands to the person that used the command. There's a lot of touch in this video, so we'll get right into it here. So first we'll be going over the setup on how to even get a Singleton or a CCA in your world. Again, CCA stands for Central Controlling Actor. It is more of a slang term used by the modding community. In the professional game development world, it's usually called a Singleton, but it is a SaveGame actor or a SaveGame actor tickable. Tickable just means that it can fire code per tick on the server. You can just use a SaveGame actor. Either one is fine. So here we have the mod data asset. And this is, in my past tutorials, we've actually set this up before. I'm just going to go over it again pretty lightly. This is the same mod that I've used in my past tutorials for multi-use and just simple modding and how to get started. In that mod, this will also be in the open source in the Arc Devkit Discord. I'll repost this with the new video and the new stuff so that people that are using the old one don't get confused. But again, PrimalGameData needs to be set in world settings here. Mod data asset, we'll go ahead and open that. And then I'll scroll to the top. You can scroll down just a little bit. It's not very far down. Server extra world Singleton actor classes, and you would just put your CCA there. There's already a CCA in this mod. To make a CCA, you can make a folder and then just right click blueprint class, let it load, and then save game. You can do save game actor or save game actor tickable. Again, it just means they're serialized with the save and they go into like the saved world file. Tickable again just means that it can do code on tick for the server or client. But you know, I haven't ever needed to do that, but you can. And again, you just go here, and then you can also just search it, Singleton, and it's there. You can have multiple if you want. There are reasons to have multiple, just to kind of keep your system separate, depending on how complex they are or how confused you want to be. But I have used multiple, like mini Singletons, as in like smaller Singletons, not mini as in multiple, mini as in smaller. So you'll have a Singleton that spawns other smaller Singletons when they're needed, but they aren't always there if they aren't needed. We will not look at the buff right now. We will go to begin play. For this example, I've removed everything from the event graph just for efficiency. You can put things on the event graph. It's better to stay away from it, but if you need it, you need it. We'll go to begin play. A lot of this is set up to be configurable because people will be looking at it. I've commented pretty much everything across this entire blueprint, and a lot of stuff is disconnected in case you need it. I'm not using it for this tutorial, but I will point it out. We will go over the initialization of the CCA first, and then I'll go over some of these extra things I've added. So first, begin play, and then we have a switch net authority, and then we run, we're separating our single player, ROS, ROC. So run on server, run on client. And then if they're single player or if they're host for a non-dedicated server, then they will run ROS first. So single player runs first the server side, and then they'll do the client side after. That's just generally a good way to handle that. Otherwise, it's basically just the top is server and then anything on bottom is client. You'll do switch net authority and then sequence. Single player will init server values first, and then client will use them, typically for visualization or just whatever. I'm not using this, but this is how you would use it. This is a value I made to turn it on and off if you are or not using it. Currently it's false, so this won't do anything. But if you wanted to do code on the first time your CCA spawns, so say they added a mod to a server, as a server owner, they added your mod, and this is the first time the CCA has ever been in the world, but the world's been there for a while. You would do loaded from SaveGame, which means that if it was loaded from a SaveGame, that means that it was there before when the world saved. And then it loaded again after a restart or whatever happened, a crash. You know, if it's false, that means it's the first time this has ever existed and it was not loaded from a save game. And in this case, you could do special things if you wanted. You don't have to. Like, again, I don't use this very often. This applies more to the mini CCAs, as in the small CCAs, as in you spawn them when they're needed and then you get rid of them when they're not needed. If it's the first time those spawn, then you're going to probably want to initialize your game or your situation that you need that CCA. And if it was already there, that means that it may have crashed while they were doing that thing, and then you want to continue using the data that was already there. It's kind of a way to validate whether the server crashed or not during whatever you needed. But this is there if you need it. You can look at it, use it, whatever. And then we're going to look at shooter game mode binds. There's a lot of stuff you can do with this. Game mode has all the cool stuff, pretty much. There's a couple that are in weird spots, but this is kind of the main one to use. To get it, you just do get game mode, cast a shooter game mode. I use a local value here just to make the graph look prettier. This is also a pseudo ROS filter because the game mode does not exist for clients. It only exists on server. This in itself is actually a singleton in itself. It's unreplicated, meaning the clients don't know about it. So if you have this in your graph, anything that comes after that cast will not run on client, just so you're aware. I've also put in a note on top. So I have split this up where you can turn on the binds or turn them off. For the purpose of this video, I have some of them on. I have pre-spawn dino off. I have player dying turned on. I have shooter character spawn turned on, and I have script commands turned on. The way that you bind to script commands is literally right here. This is kind of the way to even get them to turn on. So this value is true, and then you just bind to it, and then I have this connected to another function under the binds tab. I have a couple of them set up here. I'll go over that more later. And for player spawn, again, same thing. It's connected to the shooter character spawned bind function that I made. This is just to keep it off the event graph. Players dying, this is for the death counter that I set up for this tutorial. And I'll go over that a little bit more in depth here in just a moment. And now I have the shooter game state binds. There's only really two good ones here. There are more, and the way that you find binds, if you're just looking for them, is you can bind event to on, and then you can just kind of read what's here. So dino downloaded, dino uploaded, player list populated. ASA doesn't have a player list, so I don't know that that actually works anymore. But again, like I said, shooter game state doesn't actually have that many. The ones, so when you type it in, you'll just scroll up a little bit, and then it's under event dispatchers. These are the custom ones. All the ones outside that area are just default ones for actors and stuff. But yeah, dino uploaded, dino downloaded. Both of these are turned off because they're pretty niche. You don't really need to use them for anything. If you have like a mod that's like doing a special effect or something, or you're trying to serialize data, you can use those if you need to. But again, they're turned off there. And the prefix on these functions tells you which bind it is. So SGS is shooter game state, SGM, shooter game mode. And then that's pretty much everything for the like initialize the CCA. So on begin play, it just binds and then it does the init, like first spawn stuff. And then we'll get into the stuff that I'm actually using. So here, this calls a timer 5 seconds after the server starts, essentially, because the server will automatically spawn this. This is initialized pretty early into the startup cycle for servers. And then we wait about 5 seconds. We make sure that all the players are initialized. And then we call this function called buff players if not buffed. So if they're not buffed, they get buffed. And this is the bypass for default buffs on players through the MDA. So there's an array here. I've already edited it, so I'm just going to populate it like that. So if we add one, a lot of mods will do this, where they'll add, you know, a shooter character, and then they'll add their buff addition, which means that when this character spawns, it gets that buff. The issue with that is that it doesn't work retroactively. So if they add that and then they update their mod, and then people start playing on the server after the update, they have to respawn to get that buff, which is kind of annoying for most people. And that also applies to dinos. So if you do it, here I have the Achatina, and if I added this and they have not done a dino wipe, none of the Achatinas on the map that have not spawned since that update would have the buff. They would have to do a dino wipe, and any that spawn after will get the buff. So the same thing. They have to respawn, die, whatever. So this bypasses that. And you can do this for dinos too. You'll only need to do it once. So like you would check for like initial spawn, and then you could do a version check if you wanted to say get all Achatinas and buff them so that we don't have to do a dino wipe. I haven't done that in this CCA, but that's not very hard. It's very similar to this. But this just calls this utility function over here, and it says there are two inputs for this one. There's two reasons to use this, or that you can use this. If you input a for character, you can say just do that character specifically. If this is invalid, it will get every character on the map, which is what we want to do on server start. So when I call this with this timer, I'm not inputting a for character. So it means that it's invalid. So it will now not valid. It will get every shooter character on the map. And it says, do they have the buff? If they don't have the buff, give them the buff. And that's it. And then for the for character, if it is valid, it'll just say, do they have the buff? And if they don't, give them the buff. And super easy. This is a value down here in our variables under edit. And it's the buff to give players. Pretty simple. And then now we go through our binds. I'll show you some of the ones that I've done. I'm going to skip the script commands because that one's I'm going to go over that pretty in depth here in just a minute. So we'll go to the shooter game mode bind on shooter character spawned, and this fires for any time a player loads in. It's not just spawn, it's any time, even if the character already existed and then their client loaded in from the server menu and they join, they have now spawned in, and it fires this event. So anytime anyone joins or respawns. So we have the same thing, buff players if not buffed, and that's for our for character. We disconnect that, and then now this is valid. If we double click this will be valid, and we're saying, do they have the buff? If they don't, give them the buff. And this mimics what the default primal buff is doing over here. So if we had our shooter character here, that's basically the same thing it's doing if we added it there. So we don't need to do both. We just have to add this code and we're done. And then that means that any player 5 seconds after the server start will forever get that buff, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. This is for the player death counter. For the sake of not confusing you, I'm going to split this up a little bit, so I'm not going to go over this right now. And then pre-spawn dino, I don't have anything connected to it. Pre-spawn dino is a bind for shooter game mode that it fires for most dinos that appear. There are some edge cases, but most of your wild dinos that spawn on the map will fire this event. And just a heads up for anyone trying to use this, all dinos spawn as adult and all dinos spawn as wild. This also does not fire for uncryoing dinos. So if a dino already existed, it probably won't fire this. So on downloaded, on uncryoed, on anything. This is pretty much fired only for the NPC managers. So if an NPC manager or zone spawns a dino, it will fire this. You can also manually call this by, I have to find it. It's broadcast pre-spawn dino. Broadcast. So this, if you have a mod that spawns dinos that doesn't go through an NPC spawn manager, you can actually manually call this. So I know Omega uses this because he replaces literally every dino that spawns with his own class. And if you need to do that, you can just spawn your dino and then call this, and then any other mods that use pre-spawn dino will detect it and do whatever they want to do with it. And let's see, so upload, download, that's pretty simple. On shooter player died, or shooter character died. Again, this is for the death counter. This fires whenever a player dies. Pretty simple. Not going to go too far into that right now. And then I'll go over some INI stuff. So INI is off of the shooter game mode. And if we were going to use it, I'll kind of put it in the right spot. So if I misspelled tutorial horribly, but tutorial. Okay, so tutorial, and then we'll do INI float. Okay, so these all pretty much work the same way, except for string. String is slightly different, but I'm not going to go crazy about it. So you would want to do this on begin play for the server specifically. You can only do it for the server, in fact. If you run this on client, it won't do anything because the game mode doesn't exist for client, and this is a game mode. So this is a function that I've made for each of the ini values. So in your shooter game settings.ini, you have your header, which is in brackets, and then you have your option, which is before the equal sign, and then the value is after the equal sign. And a float is a number with a decimal. It can be a very large number, it can be a very low number. It can go negative. Strings are words, essentially, and they typically need to be in quotations inside your ini. The boolean is just true or false. And what was the other one? Integer. Integer is a 32-bit. I think it's actually 64-bit in ASA, I think. So 64-bit and can be negative, but no decimal. So it's whole numbers. Those are like the 4 types. So you would use whichever one makes the most sense, whatever your setting is. And I will go over this specifically now. So your section is the part that is in the bracket. So in our case, I made a variable for that, which is, I did make a variable for that. I meant to, there we go, which is hyper tutorial. So now I compile, and every section, this means that you don't have to type in hyper tutorial 1,000 times. If you have 1,000 ini, then you don't want to type that in every time. It'll be very annoying. And then, so if you have multiple of these, you'll just connect section to section, and then you can change your ini. And you can actually run this with arrays. But I'm not going to go over that right now because this is just a CCA video. I personally do recommend using a CCA for your ini, and then all of your structures or your buffs or whatever, getting the CCA and then getting the value. That's just how I do it, because I know the CCA is going to exist, and I don't actually know how resource intensive it is to access ini. And if the CCA just has the value, then it's probably about the same amount of resources to do either one. And I don't like putting ini on like 1,000 different things. So this is kind of clunky to use in my opinion. But so I just initialize it on the CCA, and then I give the values to my other actors. So first we get the shooter game mode, and then we init the option, which means that we look to see if it's there. So we go under the section bracket, and then we look for the option, which is left of the equal sign per line. And if we don't see the option value, we are going to write the option value, whatever current value equals. So say this is equal to 600. And since out here, I have it connected to our current value, it's going to give me 600 because that's the default value. And so we're going to write ini value at the current value underneath of our section, which is hyper tutorial. So bracket hyper tutorial section ini value equals 600. It would write it if it's not there. If the option is there, it doesn't matter what the value is, it won't touch it. It's just looking for the option to make sure that it's written. So if a server owner adds a mod and they haven't touched the ini, this will write the value for them. So all they have to do is start the server, the values are written, and they're good to go. They don't have to do anything. And then when they go to edit them, they're already there. They don't have to go through the Discord or go through whatever and type them all in. They're already written. They can just change the equals, after the option, the equals to like 300 or 600 or a million if they want. And then after it figures out if the option's there, if it is there, it doesn't do anything. If it's not there, it writes the default value. And then directly after that, we use the get variable type option ini. So get float ini returns a float, get bool returns a bool, and so on. If it's invalid, it will just return nothing, I'm pretty sure. So if I try to type in like an option name for a boolean and the init option is like a float, it won't do anything because you have to return the same value type that you're looking for. And naturally, true won't ever equal a float value because it's letters, not numbers. So don't do that. And then so it will go to the section, so brackets again, and then it'll go to the option, which it'll just go through, and anything left of an equal sign is option values. And then it will find our option and output whatever the value is. So if this actually runs and there's no values under hyper tutorial, it will write our default value, and then it'll get our default value, and it'll output our default value because it had to write it in. If there are values, say the server owner edited all the ini, they're all different, it will go through, it will look to see if it's there. It is there, so it's not doing anything. This didn't do anything. And then now we're going to find the value that the server owner put in. So let's say this value is 700. So it'll come out of here, and then we're setting it to 700. So now this would change to 700 for that instance. And that's pretty much it. It's pretty much how ini works. So if I wanted to have an ini for the range of structures, so range that a campfire works, whatever, which would typically be a float because most ranges are measured in floats. We would do range campfire. So now in the game user setting, it would go hyper tutorial, range campfire, and then equals our default is 600. If the server owner puts in 1,000, so they want the range to be 3 foundations plus like a third of a foundation. Now that will change our runtime value to 1,000. And if they don't edit it, it'll stay at 600 because that's what our default is. Hopefully that makes sense. The string is only a little bit different. As you see, there is no current value to input. So you cannot initialize a value for a string option. They can only override it. And so our section's the same. So hyper tutorial, that'll be our bracket again. So hyper tutorial in the game user setting, has brackets around it. Directly under it, we can type in whatever, name override or something. So you can look for specific strings, you can look for keywords or like special whatever. The string, you can type in whatever you want. So now we're going to the option name override. So it'll go Hypers tutorial in brackets. Directly under it, it'll look for name override to the left of an equal sign. And then here, it cannot put in a default value. There's no option for that. So all we can do is input the bracket and the option with the equal sign, and then it'll be blank. We cannot input a default value for strings. So no matter what, you can't like override it basically. So if you have the init option, it'll just input name override and then equals and then blank. It won't do anything. So you have to make sure is empty and then validate your strings. So if that output value is nothing, then just use whatever the default value is. And so you just have to be mindful of that, because there is a case where if you use this and they haven't edited, if they have not edited it, then it will just return nothing, and then you have to check for nothing. So that is our pretty light INI tutorial from the mod side anyway. And you can do as many as you want, and again, you can do an array setup, so you could do for each and then get your option, output your values or whatever. No matter how you do this, it's kind of annoying. INI is what it is. It's useful, but it's also annoying to mess with, because if you have a mod that's highly configurable and you have, say, 100 options, like S Plus had probably like 200 options. There's not a good way to initialize 200 INI options, because you have to set different values, you have to do different things. You can do it with arrays, but then it's hard to read and you have to memorize indexes. So, pick your poison at that point. So I went back to begin play. We're going to go over script commands now. So we are going to initialize on the server and then game mode binds. And then our top one here is our shooter game mode custom actor custom event. And you can bind to this on anything. That's what binds are for, actually. It just creates an event dispatcher for when something else does something, and you can just detect that. So again, you can bind to this on a buff if you want to. That's perfectly fine. I do CCAs just because having a single actor detect those things is nice. If you have this on a buff, everyone that has a buff will fire when a command is inputted. So CCAs are single actor, so they will be the only thing firing the command for your mod. If you do it on a buff, it needs to be like an admin command, or like an admin buff where only the admin has it. Or there's a potential case where you could use it as a filing system, where if it equals the EOS, then you've already identified your person. Finding them is a lot less resource intensive, so just using the CCA is a lot better. But you could do it that way if you had a particular reason for it. I digress. I kind of had a brain fart. Where is it? There it is. Okay, so I'm going to go to the command handler. This looks intimidating. And it's not that complex. We're just breaking apart the command into sections. And I have added comments around the entire thing, so you can actually visualize what we're doing instead of, code. I won't take full credit for this. This is a pretty heavily modified version of something that someone else had at some point, and I've just made it so that it fits my purpose. I don't remember who made the first one. It might have been JSlay. I don't know. But again, it's pretty heavily modified compared to what I was given a while ago, but the idea is very similar. Anyway, so here we have our mod prefix. The one that I've chosen for this mod particularly is tutorial. Makes sense. And this will identify all the commands that are ever put in for any player. And it says if it doesn't have that prefix, we aren't going to do anything, because it's not talking to us. It's not a command for this mod. And that is what everyone should do, because if you're just looking for like a simple phrase. Like I'm sure that pretty much every mod out there has a command that just says test. So if you type in script command test, you're going to fire every command that anyone ever put in for the word test. But people are not going to do script command tutorial based test, because the chances of that happening are pretty like weird. It would almost be intentional, which is kind of the idea. And I actually went a step too far. So script commands. So this is the function that the bind actually calls, and it outputs the custom event name, which we really never care about because it's only script command pretty much. The custom string, which is part of what was inputted by the player that's using it or by Archon. This does work for Archon. Instigator actor will either be nothing or it will be a player. If it's nothing, it's Archon. Well, kind of nothing. It's something that exists, but it's not a player, so we don't really care about it. And this is actually already turned into a function because it was on the event graph. I just fixed it for this video to make things more efficient and look a little bit prettier. So we'll double click that again, and I'll hit these comments just to help visualize things. And if you want to, you can read them. So if the input command was cheat script command tutorial test command 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 space 100, the only thing that comes out of this command string would be tutorial test command 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 space 100, and that would come through here. So cheat script command is automatically chopped from this, so we don't ever see cheat script command, so we don't have to worry about it. And all this does is this sets the length of our prefix, and then it makes sure that our prefix is not 0, meaning that we have to have a prefix. And then it gets the command length, and it makes sure that there is something other than just our prefix. So it just makes sure that the length of this string is longer than the prefix, and it makes sure that our prefix is not nothing. And then this will make sure that there's nothing before the mod prefix. So someone didn't type in another thing and then tutorial was a part of a different portion of the phrase. So it starts at the beginning, gets our prefix, make sure that they are equal, meaning that the first word is our prefix of the command. And then again, assuming that this is our input command, I'm not going to say that 100 times. This point will chop off the test command, this point will chop off the tutorial. It'll chop off the prefix and the first space. So now we have test command 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 and 100, and then it will put them into an array or a list, and the list will look as such, and these are our command arguments. And then we will go through, that's pretty much what all this does, is it just chops off the prefix and the space and then turns it into an array. And then we will follow this up here. Now we have our argument array. These are basically just parameters, and it will remove the first one, which is our actual command, which in this case is test command. And this actually should be open like that. So it removes the first one, and then it gets our actual command, the thing that we were typing in, and that differentiates which command to use. And then anything left in this array, which sometimes will be empty, sometimes you don't need parameters. Anything left in this array is a parameter for the command that we chose to pick. So in this case, the command that I'm using as our example, the actual command is test command, and the parameters that we're using are 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 and 100. And in our specific case for this specific command, the first one, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, is a fake EOS ID. It should be longer, but I only wanted to type 7. And the amount of potatoes to give that player is equal to 100 for this particular command. And again, I just say many commands don't need parameters. So if test command did one thing only, and it did it for the player that used the command, say it gave them 100 levels. You don't need parameters for that because the command gives 100 levels every single time to whoever uses it. We already have access to who uses the command, and we already know it's 100 levels, so there's no other parameter to have. It would just be test command, this array would be empty. And we are finding who used the command at this point. So the instigator actor that was inputted at the beginning of the command, we cast a shooter player controller, meaning that we're looking for whoever used the command. If this fails the cast, that means it was done by Archon, and that actually is it's a different type of, it'll return something else. It's not null, but you would use this if you want to figure out, if you want to give the player that used the command 100 levels. You would just do the shooter character from controller, and then this is the player that used the command. That's actually more often than not what I would do. Finding players by EOS is a little bit niche, specifically for like giving items, or if you want to give like a specific player or something. Typing in the EOS takes a lot of time, but it was requested, so I'm going to show you how to do it. And this is just set up to log whoever used the command, and it keeps track of who uses it. So it'll tell you the name, and it'll tell you the tribe, etc. And then this sets up a string for who it came from. You will pretty much not ever really need to use that, but that's there for debugging for later. For if someone has a question or something, they can just look in their logs. It's more so for server owners than anything else. So this kind of outlines what I've already said. And again, so it goes prefix and then the actual command, which in our case is test command. And then test command is compared to the switch on string, which is the actual command there. And this can't be 2 words. So if you have this here, we'll add another one. If I did test command and I did a space, that would never fire based on this system, because we remove everything that's by spaces. That's how we separate everything. So we can't have a 2-word command. You can have a single word command, and it can be as long as you want. It just can't be 2 words. If you wanted to do 2-word commands, you would have to modify the system. I suggest just not doing that, but you can do whatever you want. And then, so I've made a template. This is a blank template. What you want to do to make your own command is to copy this, rename it, and then modify that function. The blank template is meant to not be edited, so that you can use it for whatever you want. And so the command that I've made here will search by EOS and give that person the amount of potatoes. And we're going to see how that works here. First, this prints the specific command and all of the arguments. So it says the inputted command was blank, and then it says argument was EOS ID and the amount. So our arguments, again, are the first one, or 0, is EOS ID, and the next one is the amount of potatoes that we want to give that player. So our first step is to verify. Technically, this is our first step, I know. We're going to ignore that because that's debug logging, and that's technically not a step. That's just extra. Like, we don't have to do that. That's just to help server owners. So stage 1, first step, is we get the length of our arguments, and we verify that it has the minimum required arguments, which in our case is 2. We need an EOS ID, and we need the amount of potatoes. And so the length is 2. We got 2. Okay. We know 0 will be the EOS ID because that's just how we structured the command. That will be after our command. Excuse me. I'm just going to copy this and move it over here too, so I can keep track of it. So, oh my goodness. Okay. So cheat script command, tutorial, test command. Pretty much, as far as the command is concerned, everything before that point it doesn't care about. The only thing that this command worries about is the first one, which is how we chose the command that we wanted to use, which was test command. That means use this function, and then the space, and then this is our next parameter. That is our EOS ID, and then space. The second one is our next parameter, which in our case is how many potatoes. And you can structure that whatever way you want. You just have to make sure that whoever's using the command matches. So if they type this backwards, they would be looking for EOS ID 100, and they would want to give them like 1,000,000 potatoes. That's not helpful. So when you make a command, you have to make sure you remember the structure, or you document the structure, because the command is meant to be used a specific way. And there's no way for an admin to figure out how you wanted them to use a command unless you document it. So documentation is important when you use this system for any command, but that also means that you can have commands that nobody knows about. So, kind of cool. But anyway, we'll continue. So we verify we have enough arguments. Our first argument for this command is this number, or this string, because I think EOS has letters in it too. We get 0 from our argument and set that as our EOS ID. And then we get our next argument, which is the number of potatoes. Since the admin and input letters, numbers, they can put in decimal, they can put in asterisks, they can put in whatever they want. We have to verify that they actually put in a number. So we have to make sure that our next parameter is in fact a number. And if it is a number, then we convert it to an integer. If we get to this point, then we know that we can get to stage 2 because we have the information we need to continue. So, then 2, stage 2. We verify we made it this far, and I made this function. It was here, but I made it a little bit easier. This will find the EOS ID, or find the player that matches the EOS ID. and it will output whether it found it, and if the player was valid, it'll output that too. We'll take a look here. This is fairly simple. It gets all of the shooter players, meaning that the player that has the matching EOS ID has to be online. Shooter player controllers are all of the online clients, essentially. And so for each of those, we see if they have a player that is valid, meaning that they are spawned. They're not just sitting in the player creation menu or the respawn menu. They have to be existing. Then we get their player state and we get their EOS ID. So we have the EOS ID is from the player state. That's how you access it. And then we match it from the command, which is inputted over here. And then we make sure that it's not in the dev kit. In the dev kit, it will pick, we're the only player, so it doesn't care. In the dev kit, it'll just pick you because you're the only one there. So if it's not the dev kit, it'll match the EOS ID. That just makes testing simpler. So yeah, not dev kit, it'll match the EOS ID, and it'll make sure that they are not dead or dying. If they are dead or dying, it'll false. And I actually need to this to make sure that it returns not valid if it gets to that point. So if it goes through this and it does every player controller and it gets to completed and it hasn't outputted a player by then, it will return not valid, meaning that that player that you're looking for is not on the map. And if you want to, you can grab SPC. Okay, so SPC, and you can tell the admin that used the command. You can do server notification. Display time, we'll do 10 seconds. Priority, we'll just do a bunch, meaning that this will pop up over like the level up notification and all that. Okay, so now if it doesn't find a player by the EOS ID, it'll tell the admin. And assuming it's valid and it found a player, then we can move to the next stage, which is stage 3. And we can say, is our character valid? It should be. If it's not, if it got to this point and it's not valid, then we can just do this again. Oh, well, there shouldn't be the case where this happens. So we're not going to just double notify. But if it gets to this part and it didn't send the message, that should never happen based on what we're doing. So if it gets to this part, it should be true. And then we get the inventory component of the player that we found with the EOS ID. And we say increment it by the amount, which we set here based on our command, which for our testing is 100. So we inputted the command with the EOS and the amount, and then we went through, we found the amount, not the amount, we found the player with the EOS, and then we gave them that many potatoes. And that's what this command does. If you're in the dev kit, it will pretty much always work. Because it's just going to find the first player and give them 100 potatoes, but it should be the same thing essentially. So yeah, that is how script commands work, and that is a tutorial on finding players by EOS and giving them 100 potatoes. Came back to begin play. We're going to go over the death counter, and then I will showcase how it works as well. This will be a very simple way to show how to keep track of a small database, and for like scoreboards or just keeping like the amount of points someone has or other information, you can do whatever you want. This is just a simple way to track deaths and a way to display to the player how many deaths they've had or how many deaths someone else has had. I did not make a UI for this. You could make a UI very easily, and if you were to make a scoreboard, I would not use a map. I would use a struct or a struct array, because maps are not replicatable. So I kind of cheated and I did this really simply. But if you were to go back and you were to do this for a scoreboard mod of some sort or a leaderboard or whatever, you would want to use a struct array. I just want to point that out early because the way I did it is kind of cheating, because I didn't want to do a UI. So I don't technically need to replicate the information. And this is a CCA tutorial, not necessarily a replication tutorial. So I only brushed against that a little bit, not a lot. So anyway, for the death counter, what it does is it counts every time a player dies, and then it increments a value based on when they die. When they load in, it will initialize their entry, and when the entries are accessed, if there is not an entry available for that player, it will add one anyway. It's redundancy, and redundancy is not always a bad thing. I suggest doing redundant things whenever you feel like they might be necessary. This has a light amount of redundancy. But anyway, so begin play, initialized on the server, and then we're going to go back to our shooter game mode binds, and then we are going to go to on shooter character spawned. And again, this is turned on. This is what the handle is giving our players buffs. Let me find it here. Okay, so we talked about this one already. And now we're going to go to this one. And so on spawn for players, when they load in, it verifies that they have an entry, basically. This one is kind of dirty because it's not specifically what it does. But the way that it works is fine. Excuse me. If you were to do a scoreboard or anything more complex, your struct would find the entry for the player and just verify that it had data or had an entry. So you could verify by EOS or you could verify by player ID. So you would just look for each your structure array, not structure array, for each your leaderboard array and find the player ID. If that player ID exists, you're golden. That's essentially what I do here, but this also increments the value because I only wanted one function. So, you know, I just did this for simplicity's sake. So when they spawn, it tries to add 0, or if they don't exist, it will add the entry and set it to 0. We'll go over this function here really quick. So the player, we make sure they are valid, which they should always be valid, but validating is never a bad thing. You should always validate. Even if you never think that there's a chance that not be valid, just do it anyway. It doesn't matter. And then we get the linked player ID. We make sure that it's not empty. I can't think of a situation where it ever would be empty, but again, validation's never bad. So I do that a lot here, where it's just, I want to make sure that it's not empty. And then we set that to our player ID. And then we have our map, which again, I kind of cheated on this just because of simplicity's sake. If you want to add more values, you need a struct array. A map is just 2 arrays. So one of them is my values. So these are my player IDs. And then the integer is how many times they have died. If I wanted to do how many times they've killed something in PvP or how many times they've died in PvE, you know, a KD ratio of some sort, I would need a struct. You couldn't do that with a map because there's not that many values. But I digress. The player ID, I find it in the map, which means that I look against the values here and I say, do any of these values or keys match? And if it is inside the map, then I increment the value that we found by the amount that I inputted, which when they first spawn is 0. So I'm adding their amount by 0, essentially, which is what I meant by I just wanted one function. And this is kind of dirty because I find it and I add 0 if it does exist. I'm not solely looking for its existence. This is a dual purpose function. And if it doesn't exist, then I get the entry and I add it, but I set the initial amount to whatever I inputted, which was over here, amount to add, which is 0. And that's why I add 0, is because I want to set that initial value to 0. If you wanted a function that only did this, it would just have the branch, and then it would say it is false, and then you wouldn't need this, and you would just set it to 0. But I use the same function to increment the values. So that's why it's dirty. And then if we go back to the binds, shooter character died. And again, this is turned on right there. So we have verify the player exists is valid. There is a chance that they die and are not valid anymore. If they get shot with an admin gun, I'm pretty sure that destroys your character, or it did at one point. I don't know. If they are like killed and harvested in the same tick, this would technically fire but still be invalid, potentially. If they are just flat out destroyed, they would die and cease to exist in the same tick. So validating here is a little bit more important because there are potential edge cases. And here we use the same function, but we do 1. We have it set to 1. So we go through, verify the player exists, linked player ID, make sure it's not empty, and then we set our local value. We find their player ID inside of our map, and if it does exist, then we add 1 to our whatever we found. So if they had 81 deaths, and then we add 1 more, now they have 82 deaths. And then if they didn't exist, that means that this is somehow they spawned and didn't get an entry. They somehow made it to this point and just haven't died or got an entry for some reason. We add the entry and then set the initial value to 1 because they fired it on death, meaning that they died. So we need that initial entry to be 1. And then this is kind of just a funny thing that I added to show replication. Currently, replication is turned off. There are 2 values that you need. Well, one of them you need and the other one I just recommend because it'll be really weird if you don't do it. So always relevant and then replicates. Always relevant means that it never goes into stasis or hibernation. The client will never unload it, basically. It will always, like, it doesn't matter how far away the client is always going to be aware of this actor. So for other comparisons, like dinos are not always relevant, meaning that if you go out of the render range of a dino, it disappears. This is not the case. CCAs don't typically have a mesh or a physical visual aspect, meaning that you can't see them anyway. So always relevant just means that, like, it's always aware of the client, or the client is always aware of it, rather. So if you have replicates and it's not like bound to a specific area, which is really weird. I can't imagine like very many things that you would need to do that on. Like, just coding around that would be easier than just hoping that it worked, in my opinion. But like, say a boss arena or something that was kind of small, you could put a CCA in the middle of it and then have the clients inside it relevant. But I suggest just doing replicates and always relevant. That way you could just, you know it's going to work, and then you can say, like, do a distance check or something if you really needed to. But anyway, I'm going to turn this off just to so you can see the difference. So currently the CCA is not relevant to any client. It doesn't exist for clients. Clients don't know about it. It will only process server information, which means that it will not do this last part here, because this filters for player server and client only. And then now we will go to the buff portion of this. This is how the players will see how many deaths they have. Again, I did this, I kind of cheated on this a little bit because I didn't want to do a UI, so sorry. This is actually just kind of a setup that is kind of good to do for buffs. This is just extra, so you're welcome. We filter for our host or single player or server. Mainly just server is what this matters for. And then we check a bunch of values here. And if any of them are not valid, actually I need to change that. Please hold. Somebody spot the difference. I had to go back and I changed this to an or. It was an and. I don't know why. But yeah, if any of these values are not correct. So if our player value is not valid, if our shooter state, if any of these are not valid, we're going to rebuild those values. This happens basically when the buff spawns on the server. And we'll just go through, and for instigator, shooter character, or we cast shooter character, get the linked player ID, get the player state, cast the shooter player state, get the EOS ID from the player state, and then we find our tutorial CCA, and then we set all those as values to use later. You can just get those at runtime if you want, but none of these values are going to change after you start. So you can just get them all at start and then multicast so the client's aware of them. And at that point, like, you're good. They're all here. Useful values is the section I put them under. All of these values are set in stone. They're good to go. They're not going to change unless you know they're going to change. Like, unless you are purposefully changing them, they're set in stone for the most part. So this setup is not a bad idea. I will kind of go over this though. So all of these values are replicated with owner only. So only the owning client knows about them. If I can, there we go. Okay. That means that if me and Joe Schmo are next to each other and we both have this buff, Joe Schmo is not going to have access to my player ID or my EOS ID. So if his buff is running information that requires that information, those are going to be null values. They're not going to work. So, but my client has the information for the CCA, the player ID. So if I'm doing like get multi-use or anything, those values are, but Joe Schmo will not have access to any of those values for my buff. Meaning that, like, when I check this box for multicast, it's updating my client, but it's not updating his client, and vice versa. So his buff is not updating my client, but it is updating his client, which is good because most of the time you're not going to need to tell Joe Schmo about my player ID. Like, that doesn't make any sense to do that unless he's an admin and then he needs access to it. And then in that case, there's Boris. You can just click this and then change this to whatever you need. Boris is taking over the tutorial. You're welcome. So your butt out of the camera. Place the cat. I'm going to place the cat gently on the floor. So initial only means that it will not update after the first initial replication. Skip owner means that it will replicate to everyone that doesn't own it. So it would tell Joe Schmo, but it wouldn't tell me. Most of these, I don't actually know what they do. So yeah, the first couple are the only ones that you'll really ever use. And you could probably just Google what the other ones do. I don't know what they do, so you're welcome. But owner only is probably the most useful. Initial only, honestly, just kind of gets on my nerves most of the time. Skip owner, I can't imagine very many cases where I need to use that, but it's there if you want. None means that you're telling everyone, like there's no condition. Multicast will just update every client around it when the server fires it. Yeah, owner only is just to save resources because Joshmo doesn't need my information for my buff, and I don't need his, so that just saves server traffic. Anyway, I'm gonna get off that rant for a second. We're gonna go to Git multi-use. I added a new one for players not the buff owner. People that were using the other open source that I had that was not on there, but I just added it so that you could walk up to someone else and hold E and see how many times they died. And then I added one here to see your own death counter, and that's for when you hold R, and then you just select it and you can see your own deaths. Oh, Boris is coming back. Uh-oh, here he comes. Hi, Boris. Can I help you? He headbutted the mic. I hope that didn't destroy the tutorial. Anyway, can I help you, sir? He's actually the modder, by the way. I just click the buttons and he's just telling me what to click. He's made all the mods. He muted my mic. I don't know how to mod. He's the modder. His whiskers are like going in my eyeball. Just going to gently place the cat in the floor again. So anyway, and then we go to try multi-use, and then we're looking for those. So if you are the buff owner, switch on integer. We are going to return the player deaths from the CCA. And this is happening on server, so it does not need to be a replicated CCA for this to happen. And we're just going to click this, and we're going to, this is happening on the CCA, by the way. And since we have the value of my CCA, we don't have to find it. We don't have to do get actor of class and then look for the CCA. We already have it, so we don't have to worry about any of that. We go to the CCA, and then now I've made a function that has the ability to work with any inputs, so you can have multiple and only one of them needs to be valid. So if you input the player, it will do, is the player valid? If it's not valid, it will try to use the shooter player controller. If that's also not valid, it will look to see if you inputted a player ID. But if the shooter player is valid, it will use that. It'll verify that it's not empty, and then it will find that in the map. If it was not in the map already, it will set the initial value to 0, and then it will return 0. If it is in, if the player has an entry, it will return whatever it found, and then it'll come back down here, and then if that is not equal to -1, then we are valid. We are good to go to continue. If it is -1, that means that you basically didn't put in any valid information, meaning that it never got to this part over here, and it will just return -1 because that's the default value. That is our fail case. And that's actually a good tactic to do, because 0 is an acceptable response, but people can't die -1 times, so that's never going to be a value that we'll find. Your fail case or multiple responses, a lot of people will use like Boolean just to double check and verify. But if you just set your integer to a value that you will never expect or will never be a valid response, in our case is -1, you can just look for -1, and then you don't have to add another bool. You can just see if it's greater than -1, and then you're fine. So it saves a very minute amount of memory, but you do that 100 times and you're getting into big numbers. But and then if our shooter player is invalid, it'll use the shooter player controller. It'll find the linked ID there, validate that it's not empty, and so on. And then if all of this up here is empty, meaning that you didn't put in these top two, it will use the bottom one and set that value to the same thing. So you can put in any of those three, and the function will output the same information, which is good, meaning that whatever you have access to in the function that you're currently in, you can use whatever you want. And functions like this I am very fond of because it makes my other graphs look pretty, or my other blueprints look pretty. And say that I'm on a dyno and I have access to like the rider. I can just input the player because I have access to the rider easily. I don't have to do player and then get owner controller and then cast the shooter player controller and then input that, or get linked ID 100 times. I can just input the player and then the function will do the rest for me. Save work wherever you can. So that will return the player deaths. And then if it is valid, it will give a client server notification with a little sound, and it says you have died X amount of times, and this is a format text. You use the little squiggly bracket to tell it what to change. So we have our deaths out. And then now we go over here, we go to not owner. So it's someone that isn't whoever owns the buff. So Joshmo is interacting with my buff, and he says, I want to see how many times you've died. So we have our index there, and then my CCA and my player. So I'm inputting the player or the owner of the buff, so me. not Joe Schmo. I'm inputting myself saying, how many times have I died? And then it's finding that information and outputting it. And it gives Joe Schmo, which is in this case the PC that's interacting, it tells him how many times I've died. And then we can kind of look here. It'll be kind of weird looking for a second, but I'm going to try and split this here. Okay, so I'm going to give myself a bow. So if I hit E, it'll pop up at the top and tell me how many times he's died. Or, well, me, I guess, which is 0. And then if I hold R, I can go to tutorial buff. The icon's not loading due to a Devkit bug. I'm not that worried about it because the icon works. It's just the Devkit doesn't load textures every time, and I don't want to restart my Devkit. So anyway, this is the one from the multi-use tutorial that I did, and this is the one that I added for this tutorial. So my death counter, and it will say you have died 0 times. And then to make sure that this does in fact work, we're going to kill Joe Schmo, and then I'm going to wait for Joe Schmo to respawn here, and we're going to go to his buff. So I'm holding E, not R, and their death counter, and it says he has died 1 time. And if I hold R and I go back to my death counter, I've died 0 times. And as I indicated earlier, this is not a replicated CCA. So this part so far has not needed to be replicated at all. The client doesn't need to know the CCA exists for that information to work because the buff is accessing it and then giving us a notification of whatever the CCA said on the server side. The client doesn't need the information at all until we display it on the screen. And so when he died, all you heard was him dying. And that's cool. I will go back and replicate it, and then we'll try this again in a minute, and then we'll find a distinct difference on some stuff. But anyway, actually, I'll do that now, and then I'll showcase the script commands. It'll be kind of split up, but that's okay. That's all right. It's one video. We're good. So now we're going to replicate, and Boris is back. He's going to take over. Hi, Boris. Pat him on the butt. He likes the butt pats. Oh yeah. Got to place the cat on the floor again. Anyway, let's see. Replicate. So always relevant and then replicates. And then now we're going to do the same thing again. There'll be a very distinct difference this time. Oh, that's not what I meant. There we go. And we're going to pull our bow out and we're going to kill Joe Schmo. And then it played the Fortnite sound. So that happened because the multicast of the play death sound, this is now relevant to clients. So clients can play sound from the CCA, and I multicasted this, and any client that was aware of that player played sound at the player's location of it being downed in Fortnite. So yeah, you can do some pretty silly stuff. It's mostly visualization, and if you wanted to do a scoreboard, you could request the scoreboard data and display it when they access it. So it technically doesn't need to be replicated, but you would need a buff to kind of forward the information. Or if it was client available anyway and it was just a replicated scoreboard, they would just display it and then get it from the scoreboard directly. You could do it either way. Requesting the data is probably more efficient, but it'll make the scoreboard load slower. You won't flashbang the client randomly when they load in. So, either one. Now we will take my clients down to 1. So I only need 1 for this next little thing here. We're going to do our potato command here just to show you that it works. I just copied the command from there because I typed it in earlier. And then we will go to handle a command. I don't really want to breakpoint this because breakpoint kind of sucks, but I've already explained what the code does and I'm just going to show you what it does. There's no real need to breakpoint it and go over each individual spot. So I'm going to paste it. So we have our cheat, script command, tutorial, test command, EOS ID, and then the amount of potatoes. Now the Devkit is set up to use the first player, but in the live game, it will actually look for the EOS ID. But since every time I spawn in, my EOS ID is different, I'm not going to do that. Actually, I think the EOS ID is the same. I don't remember, but it's not a big deal either way. But yeah, it gave me 100 potatoes, as it was supposed to. And then now if I do, let's do 919, that number, it will maybe give me that many. It slot capped me. Okay, so yeah, it gave me a big number of potatoes. I don't know how many potatoes that is, but it's a lot. So if I do not that many, let's do 5,000 potatoes. Boom. 5,000 potatoes. So yeah, you can kind of do whatever you want. I don't know the use case that people were wanting it for, but I got requested a lot. So that's what I did. Thank you for watching the video, and I hope you learned something new, and I will see you guys around. Have a fantastic whatever day it is for you.